that. And if we're going to have to raise revenues, I would suggest that's the way to do it. And at all costs, avoid raising tax rates, which would, as he said a year ago, be a blow to our economy. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
I ask consent the call of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to considering the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nominations for the Judiciary. Mark E. Walker of Florida to be United States District Judge for the Northern District of Florida. Terrence C. Berg of Michigan to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Michigan.
Under the previous order, there will be 15 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form. The senior senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask consent to include my statement on the judicial nominees in the record.
Without objection.
I ask consent to speak on my time without delaying the vote, as in morning business on another critical matter.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I've spoken on this subject many times on the floor. The people who are affected by violence against women wonder why the Congress has delayed so on the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, the bill we passed here in the Senate. If you're a victim of violence, you can't understand such delays. So I think it's time for the Senate and the House to come together to pass the Leahy-Crapo Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, for the other body to do what we did overwhelmingly in the United States Senate. Earlier this week, I read in the Burlington Vermont Free Press, a story of Carmen Tarleton. She's a woman from Thetford, Vermont. Thetford, Vermont is a small, quiet, beautiful little town in our state. 5 years ago, Carmen's estranged husband broke into her home. He beat her with a baseball bat. He poured industrial-strength lye on her, severely burning a great deal of her body and nearly blinding her. Her doctors said that she had suffered the most horrific injury a human being could suffer. Today, of course, she is still disfigured and continues to experience pain from these injuries of 5 years ago. The stories like hers remind me that every day we do not pass VAWA, more people are suffering. I ask consent that a copy of the article I referred to be included in the record.
Objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, the distinguished presiding officer was a strong supporter of this bill. On the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, as many of our colleagues were on both sides of the aisle. We tried to keep this as a nonpartisan, even beyond bipartisan, a nonpartisan bill, because certainly my experience has been that the violence occurs not because you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. Violence against women occurs in all strata, in all categories. So Senator Crapo and I put together our bill after listening to victims and the professionals who work with them every day. did not want provisions in our bill included to score political points. They were there to address the urgent needs of vulnerable victims. That was the one thing we wanted. This wasn't a Democratic or Republican bill. This was to address vulnerable victims. One key provision in our bipartisan bill would allow tribal courts limited jurisdiction to consider domestic violence offenses committed by non-Indians against Indian women on tribal lands. And I relied on the experiences of Senator Crapo and others who come from states where there are tribal lands. And as we went into this and talked to the leaders of various tribes around this country, I heard that the violence against Native women is not only appalling, as we knew, but it's become an epidemic. It's reported that almost 3 in 5 Native women have been assaulted by their spouses or intimate partners. And much of the violence is committed by non-Native Americans, non-Indians. Federal and state law enforcement may be hours away, and lack of resources to respond to these cases, while tribal courts lack jurisdictions to consider these cases. So what happens, the perpetrators are, in effect, immune from the law. And the worst part about it, Mr. President, they know they're immune from the law. So the jurisdiction provision that passed the Senate in the Leahy-Crapo bill would be a significant step toward addressing this horrific problem, but also would ensure that no abuser is above the law. Even though our tribal provision is limited and guarantees comprehensive rights, House Republicans have objected to it. So I want to come to the Senate today and be able to report to my colleagues what I hope is a breakthrough on this issue and this important bill. 2 conservative House Republicans with leadership positions in the Republican House majority have introduced a reasonable middle ground position regarding tribal jurisdiction. Representative Ice of California, Representative Cole of Oklahoma have introduced the Violence Against Indian Women Act, H.R. 6625. Now, the Ice of Cole bill includes a provision that allows defendants to remove a case to federal court if any defendant's rights are violated. This modification should ensure that only those tribes that are following the requirements of the law and providing full rights can exercise jurisdiction, and the defendants can raise challenges at the beginnings of a case. The House Republican leadership should give serious consideration to this Republican proposal so we can move forward and protect thousands of victims, non-Native Americans and Native Americans. The National Congress of American Indians has sent a letter and urged Senator Crapo and me to take a serious look at the Ice of Cole provisions. We are. I'm consulting with senators on both sides of the aisle regarding this proposal so we can find a way forward. I urge the House Republican leadership to do so as well. Mr. President, I ask consent that a copy of the NCAI letter be included in the record at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
You know, I remain committed to finding solutions to all the areas of contention between the House and the Senate on VAWA. We ought to be able to pass legislation that includes provisions addressing the violence on tribal lands and the need to protect immigrant women and those who have not had access to services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And I'm reaching out to the House Republican leadership. I look forward to their seizing this opportunity provided by these senior House Republicans to work with me and Senator Crapo and the 68 senators from both parties who voted for the Leahy-Crapo VAWA bill way last April. Then we can complete our work, send this bill to the President before we adjourn this year. He will sign it. Because every day, every week, every month that goes by, there are more horrific accounts of domestic and sexual violence. Whether a victim in Thetford, Vermont, or Kansas City, we owe it to them to come together and find a compromise. I've said on this floor several times I still have nightmares from the domestic violence crime scenes I saw as a prosecutor in Vermont. I became a prosecutor, Mr. President, at a time when many of the laws were changing, search and seizure laws, Miranda laws, so forth. And I would go with the police to crime scenes to give them advice on what the new laws might mean. A lot of times those scenes were at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. So many times we'd see battered women, sometimes no longer alive. What's happened? I have nightmares from those. But I remember the police who moved, who never asked, is this an immigrant? Is this woman gay or straight? Is this woman Native American or not? They just wanted to stop the crime from happening again. And we give them a lot of tools so we can do that. And the thought that our inaction could lead to more such scenes I saw there is tragic. So Congress must act now to protect victims of rape and domestic violence. I'm optimistic we can move together now that several House Republicans support a compromise position in tribal jurisdiction. I look forward to hearing from the House Republican leadership, and I ask consent that my full statement be included in the record.
No objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, as we're going to vote at 12, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. President, let me first thank Senator Leahy, members of the Judiciary Committee for the hearing that they held on Terry Berg's nomination for the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. I know how hard Senator Leahy works to get these judges and their judicial nominations to the floor, and we're deeply appreciative for all the efforts over all the years, indeed may I say decades, of my good friend Senator Leahy. I think that every member of the Judiciary Committee who had the chance to read the record or to be there during the hearing will agree that Mr. Berg is an outstanding nominee for our district court bench. I won't go through all of his background. I will put most of my statement in the record because I know we are approaching the time when we are going to be voting on a number of matters, but I can only summarize this by saying that Mr. Berg's qualifications are extraordinarily impressive. He will make an excellent addition to the Eastern District Court. He's going to serve with great distinction, and all of us, and I know I speak for Senator Stabenow as well, in terms of strongly supporting this nomination. We all thank our colleagues for bringing this nomination to the floor and for the strong support that he got in the Judiciary Committee. And with that, I will yield the floor and note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. President, I ask that further proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session for the consideration of H.R. 6156, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 552, H.R. 6156, an act to authorize the extension of non-discriminatory treatment, normal trade relations treatment to products of the Russian Federation and Moldova, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, there will be 10 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, we will soon be voting on whether to establish permanent normal trade relations, otherwise known as PNTR, with Russia and Moldova, and to update Russian human rights legislation. We have to take many difficult votes in this chamber, but this is not one of them. In fact, this is a rare opportunity to pass a good bill that we all can agree on. PNTR is good for United States jobs. Russia is a fast-growing market. When Russia joined the WTO in August, it opened its markets to the other 155 members of the WTO who have PNTR with Russia. PNTR will give U.S. farmers, ranchers, businesses, and workers new opportunities in Russia and new jobs here at home. Our competitors in China, in Canada, and Europe are now taking advantage of these opportunities because they have PNTR with Russia. They already have it. We are the only WTO member missing out on these opportunities. If we now pass PNTR, we can level the playing field and compete. And if we compete, we will win. We sell more beef, we sell more aircraft, we will sell more tractors, we will sell more medical equipment, and our banks and insurance companies will grow. PNTR will give our knowledge industries greater protections for their intellectual property, and our farmers will have new tools to fight unscientific trade barriers. If we pass PNTR, American exports to Russia are expected to double in 5 years. This bill has strong enforcement provisions to help ensure that American farmers, ranchers, businesses, and exporters get the full benefit of PNTR. And this bill has strong human rights provisions. Senator Cardin's Magnitsky Act punishes human rights violations in Russia and helps to address the corruption problems Russia now faces. In July, the Finance Committee voted unanimously, 24-0, in favor of PNTR legislation. And last month, the House of Representatives passed PNTR legislation, now before us, with 365 yes votes. Now we need to act to pass this bill that supports U.S. jobs. Let's take advantage of this opportunity, take a good vote on a good bill. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of giving U.S. workers and businesses a chance to compete and vote in favor of PNTR. And I might add, Madam President, I want to very much thank my colleague from Utah, Senator Hatch, who's a very good person, with whom we work very closely. Together, the two of us make a good team to get this legislation passed.
Madam President,
The senator from Utah.
I want to praise the distinguished chairman of the committee. He's done a wonderful job on this, and of course it's been a pleasure to work with him. Madam President, this bill marks an important step forward in our relations with Russia and Moldova. Once this bill is signed into law, our workers, job creators, and farmers will be able to take full advantage of Russia and Moldova's accession to the WTO. The bill includes strong enforcement provisions to ensure that Russia lives up to its international trade obligations. And finally, this bill will help advance human rights and the rule of law in Russia. Today's vote would not be possible without the combined efforts of many dedicated public servants. First, I would like to thank the staff at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Many of them toiled for years to bring Russia and Moldova into the WTO, often at great personal sacrifice. I also would like to take a moment to thank my colleagues for all of their hard work in helping to craft this bill. An open and transparent dialogue was critical to our success. And I would particularly like to again express my appreciation to all the Republican members of the Finance Committee who worked with me and my staff in good faith to develop a strong enforcement package which will address many of the concerns we all have regarding our bilateral trade relations with Russia. And finally, I would like to thank my friend and colleague Senator Baucus and his wonderful staff. I ask unanimous consent that we put some names in the record before this is done, because he and his staff have had a great willingness to work with us to make sure that our concerns were addressed in the bill. The process we undertook in the Finance Committee is emblematic of how the Finance Committee should work. It is my sincere hope that this will be a model for future legislation. Working together, I am confident we can continue to develop policies to grow our economy through international trade and hopefully help advance the rule of law around the world. This is a good package that deserves our strong support. I urge all of my colleagues to join in supporting this bill. I believe that we've got to do more in the international trade world. Earlier, due to the efforts of the distinguished chairman, Senator Baucus, and his staff and my staff, we were able to get the Korean, Colombian, and Panamanian treaties through. These were steps in the right direction after all these years. And to have this happen is going to be a wonderful thing, I think, for our country and really for Russia itself. And it certainly is going to help us go down the line in doing what's best for our own trade. One of the other special things that's in this is it's going to cause Russia to have to live up to some international trade and international intellectual property laws, international laws. And we in this country believe in obeying those laws, and I have to say Russia, India, and China have invaded intellectual property in areas that they shouldn't have, and hopefully this type of agreement, the PNTR, will help alleviate that problem. So I urge my colleagues to join Senator Baucus and myself in voting for this very important bill. And again, I want to thank staff on both sides for the wonderful work that they've done, and the trade representative in his office as well for the wonderful work that they've done. I reserve the balance of my time.
President.
The senator from Montana.
Madam President, I thank the senator from Utah. He's a good man. I also want to thank the top trade staff who helped put this bill together. Amber Cottle on my side, and Everett Eisenstadt works for Senator Hatch, worked very hard. They lead very good trade teams, I might add. Very, very talented, able folks, obviously. I see this, too, as a vote to kind of help propel us to next level of trade expansion. One is TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being worked on by the United States and other Asian countries. I think it's a big, dramatic opportunity for growth. Second, working with Europe, potential free trade agreement with Europe. There's a lot of interest in Europe in joining with the United States and reducing barriers to trade. That's a great opportunity we should take advantage of. And obviously, that raises another question, which is the Trade Promotion Authority. We, in Congress next year will work to get Trade Promotion Authority passed so that we can conclude these trade agreements and help American companies and equally importantly, help American consumers. Because American consumers and American workers are frankly helped dramatically by a properly negotiated trade agreement, one that's in the best interest of the United States. So, Madam President, thank you very much for all that you do, too, and I yield the floor.
Who yields time?
Madam President, I yield back our time.
And I am pleased to yield back our remaining time and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will read the bill for a third time.
Counter number 552, H.R. 6156, an act to authorize the extension of non-discriminatory treatment, normal trade relations treatment, to products of the Russian Federation and Moldova, and so forth and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on passage of H.R. 6156. The yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio.
Did I miss something on Tuesday night
Yes.
at dinner? I did.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
Had I been at Bible study on Tuesday night? I heard this.
Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran.
I just have to, okay, and open these, I'll set it.
Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Sir. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan.
Aye.
Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Anoa'i. Sir. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baucus, Begich, Bingaman, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Coons, Dement, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Isaacson, Johans, Lautenberg, Leahy, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Nelson of Florida, Risch, and Warner. Mr. Levin voted in the negative. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman. Aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss. Aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer. Aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Aye. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Crapo. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Shaheen. Mr. Shaheen. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte. Aye. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. Aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe. Aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski. Aye. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor. Aye. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer.
Aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison. Aye. I have you. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. And away. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? The yeas are 90. The ayes are 92. The nays are 4. The bill is passed. The Majority Leader. May we have order in the chamber, please? The Majority Leader.
Madam President, this morning, Senator McConnell, as we do a lot of the time, came to the floor. Senator McConnell made a serious offer dealing with the debt ceiling of this country, one of the most important issues facing the country. It's a serious offer. I personally haven't read it. My staff's looked at it. And it's important enough that I would like to have a vote on it this afternoon. But we have to, I need to have a caucus, explain to my troops what this is all about, and I'd like to do that. So everyone here, if we can work something out with Senator McConnell, I'd like to have a vote sometime this afternoon. I do need to have a caucus. I set that for 1:30. We have another vote right now. And if my Republican colleagues think there's not a chance of having the vote this afternoon, you know, I can only do it by unanimous consent. And if someone's going to object to it, they should do it now. And we'll arrange another time to address this issue. So the issue is, everybody, Senator McConnell has made a proposal on how we handle the debt ceiling, and we have to get permission from my Republican colleagues whether we can have a vote on this afternoon at a time that would be as convenient as possible. I don't think we need a lot of time to debate it. We've done that over the years lots of times.
How about 1 o'clock? Yeah.
I know there are airplanes that people want to leave in, but this is very, very important, Madam President, and I have to have my this vote will end about 1 o'clock. I've scheduled the caucus for 1:30. There's no reason we couldn't start the caucus at 5 after 1. Move it up, everybody. Eat your lunch a little faster or whatever you're going to do. But I do need some direction from my Republican colleagues.
Okay. Great. Great.
So if I hear no one yelling no, then we'll go ahead and schedule as soon as we can this afternoon a vote.
The senator from Texas.
Could I ask the Majority Leader,
May we have order in the chamber, please? Take your conversations out.
I know that there are those on my side who would also like to have a conference to talk about this. Would you give us an indication, though, because people obviously would like to be able to plan a time frame of a vote that might give us both time to talk if we start at 1 o'clock and then move on?
Madam President, through you to my friend from Texas, the conference we're going to have won't take very long, half hour, 45 minutes. So we could finish that, I'm sure, by 1:45 or something like that, and we could have a vote at 2 o'clock, I'm sure.
Thank you, Madam President.
Okay.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session. Under the previous order, the question occurs on the Walker nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal.
Was 92 to
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts.